At 3:10 in the morning on August 21st, 1942, the mouth of Alligator Creek lay under a darkness so complete it seemed to erase distance itself. The northern coast of Guadalcanal did not sleep. The jungle behind the beach sweated in the heat, breathing out rot and salt and wet earth. Insects shrilled above the tide. The sandbar at the creek mouth, narrow and exposed, looked almost harmless in the starlight. But on the far side of it, Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki's detachment waited in the undergrowth with bayonets fixed, rifles clutched tight, and certainty already settled in their minds. Ichiki believed the Americans ahead of him were shaken, scattered, and close to collapse. In his diary, he had already written the phrase, "enjoyment of the fruit of victory." The battle, as he understood it, was merely the confirmation of a conclusion already reached. What he did not know was that the darkness in front of him was not weakness. It was preparation. That was the deeper significance of the moment. Guadalcanal was not just an island struggle over an unfinished airfield. It was the place where one military imagination collided with another. Ichiki had come forward with roughly 900 men, dispatched under the assumption that the American landing force around Henderson Field was small enough to be thrown back by one violent blow. In reality, Major General Alexander Vandegrift held the perimeter with nearly 11,000 Marines. The men behind the American lines were not a temporary garrison waiting to panic. They belonged to a force that had been reshaped in the interwar years into something the Japanese High Command had never properly measured: an amphibious military culture built on rehearsed landings, decentralized initiative, field discipline, and a long intellectual preparation for war in the Pacific. More than 20 years earlier, Marine planner Earl Hancock Ellis had forecast the island war to come in advanced base operations in Micronesia, identifying the central problem with unnerving accuracy: hostile tropical islands, fortified coasts, long logistics, and a determined Japanese enemy. The Marines on Guadalcanal were not inventing their response to the Pacific. In a real sense, they had been studying for this night before many of the men now carrying rifles had ever enlisted. MARSOC, U.S. Marine Corps Forces, Pacific. The contrast between expectation and reality was almost total. Japanese doctrine placed faith in offensive spirit, in moral force, in the belief that boldness could fracture an enemy who lacked inner hardness. American Marines were often dismissed in Japanese assumptions as materially rich but spiritually soft, men presumed to dislike sacrifice and to bend under tropical pressure. Yet before Ichiki's column ever moved, warning had already reached the Marine perimeter. A patrol had recovered documents pointing to the Japanese approach. Jacob Vuza, a Solomon Islander scout captured, tortured, and left for dead, cut himself free and staggered back through the jungle to alert the defenders. The line was readied. Artillery was registered. Machine guns were placed to rake the sandbar and the shallow approaches around it. In the dark, nothing announced this preparation except stillness. Then, when the first Japanese wave came running across the open ground, the stillness broke into the one sound that would come to symbolize the whole collision of systems: the hard, sustained clatter of American machine guns. That metallic rhythm was more than gunfire. It was supply, training, discipline, and industrial depth made audible in the night. At 3:10 a.m., the first assault struck. Roughly 200 Japanese soldiers rushed the sandspit in column, trying to drive through the Marine line before the defenders could settle. Instead, they entered intersecting fire from rifles, machine guns, and 37mm guns firing canister at close range. Some attackers broke through the first edge of the position, but not for long. Marine fire and local counterattacks sealed the breach. More Japanese pressed forward through the same narrow funnel, and the same mechanical clatter greeted them, steady and impersonal, as if the line itself had turned to iron. A flanking effort through the surf failed as well. The darkness that Ichiki had counted on did not belong to him. It concealed the Americans until the exact moment it no longer did, and then it magnified every muzzle flash into a warning too late to heed. By dawn, the sandbar was strewn with bodies. By late afternoon, Marine forces had crossed upstream, tanks had come forward, and the survivors of the detachment were enveloped and destroyed. Official histories record 34 Marines killed and 75 wounded. Japanese losses were catastrophic, with roughly 800 dead and only a handful of prisoners taken. Ichiki did not survive the battle. Whether he died in the last fighting or took his own life, the result was the same. The prediction in his diary had been buried with his command. And yet the most haunting part of Alligator Creek was not the scale of the defeat. It was how little the institution that produced it was able to learn from it. Rear Admiral Raizo Tanaka later described the destruction of Ichiki's force as a tragedy and as a lesson in the hopelessness of bamboo spear tactics against defended American positions. But the Japanese military system had bound itself to assumptions too central to be easily surrendered. The code against capture ensured that defeated garrisons often died with their experience still locked inside them. The belief in spiritual superiority over material power remained lodged deep in planning. The enemy model persisted even as the evidence accumulated against it. At Edson's Ridge, and later at Tarawa, the same pattern returned with variations. At Tarawa, Rear Admiral Shibasaki reportedly declared that 1 million Americans could not take Batio in 100 years. The Marines took it in 76 hours. The cost was terrible, but the meaning was clear. Again and again, Japanese defenders expected American bodies to stop moving when losses mounted. Again and again, they did not. The clatter heard at Alligator Creek became a larger sound across the Pacific, not just bullets leaving barrels, but an entire system refusing to exhaust itself. By Okinawa, some Japanese planners had at last begun to accept what Guadalcanal had first exposed. The old doctrine of decisive offensive battle gave way to a grim war of attrition fought from caves and tunnels because American firepower had become impossible to ignore. Japanese staff studies acknowledged that U.S. divisions possessed several times the firepower of their own, and beyond that stood the crushing additional weight of naval guns, aircraft, fuel, shipping, and replacement men. At that point, the war was no longer a contest between rival myths of national character. It had become a collision between ideology and accumulated reality. And reality had a sound. It was the sound of machine gun belts feeding in darkness, of artillery registered in advance, of supplies brought ashore, of junior leaders taking over when senior ones fell, of an institution built to continue functioning even inside chaos. The Marines were not fearless, and they were not untouched by terror. But they had been formed inside a system that expected fear and planned beyond it. That was the difference. So the sandbar at Alligator Creek remains one of the war's most merciless little stages. A few yards of exposed ground, a humid night, a colonel certain of victory, men moving forward under beliefs inherited from an empire that had taught them the enemy would run. But on the other side waited an enemy that had spent years preparing for exactly such a test. And when the moment came, it answered not with panic, but with that steady metallic pulse in the dark. The tragedy of Guadalcanal was not only that men died there, it was that so many died because the ideas guiding them could not bear correction. Freedom, abundance, democracy, these words can sound soft in peacetime. On that coast in 1942, they sounded different. They sounded like a weapon firing in disciplined bursts through tropical darkness, like a line that would not dissolve, like a society whose strength lay not in one man's certainty, but in many hands keeping the mechanism alive until dawn.